So with that, I would like to just officially welcome you to today's session, Pain to Power, using public narrative and community organizing to create a more equitable world. We are so excited to be joined by Janae Bates and Catherine Evans. And I am going to stop sharing my screen. So Janae and Catherine, you can share yours and introduce yourselves.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you to everyone who is joining us from all over the world, it looks like. I am honored to be here with you and to be joined by my co-presenter, Janae Bates. And I'm Catherine Evans. I am currently in Kansas City, Missouri, where I live and do most of my work at Rooted Strategy. And my work is really focused on helping to build networks for greater impact in communities, beginning with relationships. I think relationships are really the core of who we are and how we're going to change the world. And so I've really focused my work for my career on building relationships and building networks through organizing, storytelling, and building other forms of capacity. And I'll let Janae introduce herself and then we will kick it off together.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am Minister Janae Bates. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently the communications director for Yes for Minneapolis. I saw in the chat, there's a few folks from Minnesota and Minneapolis, shout outs. I am also the communications director for Isaiah and Faith in Minnesota. And so I get to do the amazing work of grassroots organizing with a statewide coalition in Minnesota. And so I'm really excited to talk about this notion of pain to power and advancing our own public narratives so that we can create the world that we all want and need to thrive.
Thank you so much, Janae. So we're going to kick off this conversation with a question that we would like for everyone in this room to reflect on. And Janae and I will also reflect on it together in conversation with you. And we welcome you to join the conversation in the chat if you're able. So the question here is, when was a time when you needed to be heard and believed that you could be? Janae, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, so I think of a time before I moved to Minnesota over 5 years ago now, when I was both a communicator and a minister of social justice with a congregation in Cleveland, Ohio. And a lot of my work was actually being with families after their loved ones were killed by police officers. And as you can imagine, that is really taxing work, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And it felt like a lot of what we were doing was cyclical. It was crying, weeping, mourning, grieving, rinse and repeat without an off ramp. And so now, several years later, I found an off ramp through community organizing and community engagement that allows us to leverage awareness and actually have impact in policy and legislation and holding folks accountable to get the things done that we actually need so that we don't have to continue that cycle. And so being able to do that with the organizing folks that I've mentioned with Isaiah and Faith in Minnesota, and also now with the coalition with Yes for Minneapolis has been phenomenal. And now I believe that I most certainly have a voice and a collective one in community. What about you, Catherine?
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And you know, Janae and I are both organizers at heart, and so I'm thinking back to a time long ago before I knew what to call this vocation of organizing, when I was in middle school, and my family had just moved to a new, very small, very conservative, very rural town in Northwest Tennessee. And I got into middle school and I learned that the homecoming court. So if you're not familiar with that, every year the school has a homecoming football game where the alumni come back, and there's a big celebration, and part of that is to have this court, this group of students that we honor and recognize. What I learned immediately was that the homecoming court was segregated by race, which was shocking. And I'm pretty young, so this was not that long ago, and I was so just deeply offended and in shock. And I really felt like the school needed to understand that this was not okay. And so I wrote, with my mother's help, a very detailed letter about why this was inappropriate and why we needed to change this practice, and walked it to the principal's office. And that was the last year that the homecoming courts were segregated by race. And so that was my, I think, the first moment that comes to mind for me when I felt like, you know, I think that my perspective on this is important and it's relevant, and I think it affects more than just me. And I believe that if I say something, it will make a difference, and it did. So that's my story.
Yes.
Yeah, and I would just love for you all to reflect again on this question, to, you know, just think about how this rings true for you in your life, a time that you needed to be heard, and believe that you could be. So something for you to ponder as we move forward into this conversation today. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So I just want to touch down on what our goals are for today. You saw the learning objectives when you signed up for this workshop, I'm sure. But really, we are here to help you understand and make sense of two core concepts. The first is we want to help you to understand the intersections and opportunities and challenges related to sexual violence, narrative change, and systems change. So there's two parts of that: narrative change and systems change. We also want to help you understand how public narrative and community organizing can be leveraged as strategies to disrupt sexual violence, and the ways in which sexual violence, sexual assault are normalized in the popular consciousness, and to give ourselves a new way of imagining a world without sexual violence, and how these tools of public narrative and community organizing are very practical ways for us to access that imagination. So I'm excited to get into this with you all, and I think we're going to move into a bit of an opening activity that we can all participate in together. So I hope you will join us. I do want to provide a heads up that the activity that we're about to do, it may be triggering for some people. It involves looking at certain images. And I wanted to just acknowledge that and give you an opportunity to be aware of how you're feeling in your body. And if you are not able to participate in this activity or not willing to participate in this activity, we accept where you are, and we're grateful that you're here. And we will move on from this section in about 5 minutes, and we'll announce when we are moving forward so that you can rejoin us. So I will now turn it back over to Janae.
All right, folks. So what we want you to do is we are going to have you leverage your Google search bar, particularly the image search bar. And so we want you to Google sexual assault solutions or sexual violence solutions. And again, you're doing this in your image search bar. So just like pull up some of those images and kind of like peruse them a little bit. Now, I'm giving you a second to do that. But while you do it, I want you to consider what is the broad message that you think you're getting from the general images that you're finding in this search. What if there was someone who was actually searching for the solutions around this? Do you think that they would find them? Lots of infographics I'm seeing. And in these infographics, right, lots of text, survivor focus, that's good. Statistics, lots of statistics for sure. Are there patterns that you're noticing? Sexual assault on campus, campaigns, awareness, a lot of white people. Yeah, preventive measures, okay. Some hotlines. I'm seeing lots of stats and infographics. Okay. Good, good. I'm glad everyone's doing this. All right, so what are there any like general top line messages you think you're getting from all of these infographics and content and stats? Break the silence. Lack of assistance information. Prevention, okay, that's good. And I also want to acknowledge that helplines, all right, that we, because we're all located in different places, we also have different histories, like actual digital histories of what we Google. Those things might shift. So we might be seeing different things based on where we are in the world and what we are doing and how we do it. Stop. Yeah, I see that. Stopping the silence. Stop is like a top line message. So here's the things that we noticed, Catherine and I, when we were looking, when we looked this up, right? Similar to you all, we most certainly have seen lots of infographics, some imagery of folks that we assume to be femme, lots of statistics, and lots of stop and prevent sexual violence, sexual assault. What we also noticed was a lot of lifting up the pervasive nature of which sexual assault happens. So that a kind of reminder that everyone's doing it or it's happening to everyone. Just the nature of the frequency of it, almost to the point to where it feels a little normal, right? And so we are going to have a conversation over the next bit of time together about how we can start to break some of the frameworks that have allowed us to stay in this deeply seated pattern that tends to be connected to individuals and how they do something, or systems and how they do something, and actually puts us on a pathway towards real interventions, and into a space where we can actually shift a public narrative and leverage our coalition spaces, our organizing spaces, our faith communities, and the many, many people in our lives who have really impactful stories, and how they can tell those, both like converting their pain into a powerful storytelling opportunity. All right, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you, Janae. Yeah, so I really appreciate this conversation about patterns, and I appreciate everyone for lifting up the patterns and messages that you observe as you do this activity with us. I'm now going to invite those of you who took some time away to please come back in, please rejoin us. And I'm going to move into a little bit of an exploration of patterns. Patterns are an important way for us to make sense of what's happening in the world around us. And we know that there are certain patterns that emerge in human systems, patterns that are a function of our interconnectedness as individuals and of systems, as Janae was saying. So I want to share this framework. I guess that's how you would think about it, that comes from the Human Systems Dynamics Institute. And this is the result of some research that Glenda Yoyang did with and about organizations. But it's really helpful in thinking about just any kind of complex human system. And when you think about it, there are endless examples of complex human systems. Each one of us as an individual, with our bodies that have multiple functions and our brains that are exchanging information and resources, is a complex human system, right? All the way out to this complex human system that is this Zoom room, right? And this conference where we've all come together and we're all thinking about sexual violence and what we can do to make a difference. And so there are many forms of human systems. And so this container difference exchange, these components that make up a system really help us to understand how patterns emerge in a system, how they're maintained, and maybe even if we're wise enough about these components, how we can shape them, how we can actually shift the patterns that exist in our systems. So the patterns that shape our lives, everything, the success, the joys, the challenges, the opportunities, just the patterns of everyday life and work, they emerge as we move through the complexity of where we live, work, and play. And they are shaped by the interdependency of these three conditions. Knowing this is really good for us because it helps us increase our options to take wise action to influence those patterns towards greater coherence, greater relationship, greater resilience. So the container, that component is it's about the similarities that contain the system while patterns emerge. So the container that we're sharing right now, friends, is this workshop. We are in this container, right? The difference is those significant differences that make a difference and have influence on what we do, how we act, how we think, right? So each of us represents difference in some way, where we are coming from, how we identify, what our history and background is. Those are the differences that make a difference in how we engage in this container that we're sharing together. And then the final piece is the exchange. And we'll talk more about exchange later. Exchange is any flow that generates change in a system. So feedback, dialogue, entertainment, conversation, rules, right? Regulations, experiences, giving and receiving. These are all ways that the system engages in exchanges that shape patterns. So what Janae and I are doing right now is a form of exchange, right? We're offering you our wisdom, what we know, and then the exchange that we'll receive back from you is how you make use of it, how you interpret it, the questions you ask about it. So we're all participating in this. So, and the more people that are involved in a system, by the way, and the more diverse and the differences and exchanges are in that system, the more complex and interconnected these patterns become. So it's important to understand this because when we're talking about systemic sexual violence, we're actually talking about multiple intersecting human systems. And you might think about that as an ecosystem across time and space in which patterns have emerged and been maintained such that sexual violence is it's patterned in the way that we saw in our Google search, right? And so it's this complex interplay between all of these factors that help us understand what puts people at risk for experiencing or perpetuating violence, and also what protects people from experiencing or perpetuating violence. And so another way to think about this that many of you might have seen, especially if you are a public health practitioner, is the Socioecological Model. And this beautiful adaptation of the CDC Socioecological Model of Prevention is contributed to us by the Black Women's Blueprint. And it's culturally specific and has a lot of relevance for what we're going to be talking about today. So I want to offer it to you as another way of thinking about the complexity and interplay of these different factors. And I just have to say a special blessing to the Black feminist lens, because unlike the CDC model, this model also includes layers of structural, historical, environmental, and spiritual, which are all connected, as is everything else in the human ecosystem, right, that we inhabit. So let me give you an example of how we think about this model, just a sort of applied example. Someone born as a woman is more likely to experience sexual assault than someone born as a man. That's an individual trait, right, that influences sexual, the likelihood of sexual violence. If she is living in a family or a community, so her relationships or her community that tolerate sexual harassment, discrimination, or assault, that increases the likelihood of her having an experience of sexual violence. If she actually does experience sexual violence, she is now faced with our society's tendency to not believe victims. which may keep her from finding safety and healing. And then we take it out further, thanks to the Black Women's Blueprint, to the structural, right? And this allows us to look at racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, which are not simply societal beliefs, but factors that actually influence how this person would experience sexual violence and its effects. Then we have history, right? Her historical grounding is relevant because history teaches us where there have been shifts or not been shifts in the way that our culture and our community prioritizes what happens in a sexual violence event, right? And then there's also these realities of the environmental level, which we're all reckoning with, which affect how she experiences place and safety of place and permanence of place. And then there's the spiritual lens, which is how herself, her spirit, her inner self is affected by sexual violence, either through PTSD, some call it a spiritual wound, which affects her resilience and her ability to cope with that traumatic experience. So again, I just want you to keep these two ideas in your mind as we move through this conversation as ways to help re-ground you in the interconnection between individual and systems and everything in between, right? So let's see. So, and we encourage you to ask questions and keep the conversation going in the chat as we move forward. So back to the exchange, right, that I talked about earlier, there are patterns in the stories we tell and the way that we tell them. And stories are, in any system, human system, one very common exchange that we have. Our narratives about sexual assault and sexual violence are part of a pattern. We are typically focused, as you saw in our earlier activity, on stopping and preventing sexual violence, which is so critical. And I also want us to think about, and Janae is going to help us to think about, how do we create a future without sexual violence? So I want to push into your imagination, how would the story be different if offenders knew that people will always report and always be believed? How would the story be different if victims of harm trusted to report to the police? So I'm going to invite Janae back in to continue to push our political imagination as we talk about moving from pain to power.
Thank you for all of that, Catherine. All right, so we're talking about moving, like this idea of being able to do our own personal storytelling in a way that will impact the many concentric circles that create the political landscape, the communities, the neighborhoods, the cities, states, the country, and the world that we need. And so through public narrative and community organizing, we can give people an opportunity to have the kind of political imagination that is required of us. It is required of us to have it in order to create the world we need. And so the reason this is really important, and this is actually going to feel very different than what I think many of us have built a memory muscle around. Usually when we talk about storytelling, we think about it in a particular formula. And the formula usually says, start with the problem first. Tell everyone how awful, horrible, terrible things are or is. And then offer what the solution could be. And then invite that person or people into action. And you will probably notice that particular that formula in what we view in our media. I'm sure you have many, if you're anything like me, several dozen, maybe several hundred emails from organizing, community, philanthropic spaces that also do that, that talk about the problem, the solution, and invite you to action. What tends to happen when we do that, it's a twofold issue. One, we're talking problems. And one of my favorite linguists in the world, Anat Shankar-Osorio, loves to say, folks got 99 problems and they don't want yours, which is a reality. And even though it has been a useful tool to get people angry enough or enraged enough, upset enough to take one step, it's not sustainable for long-term organizing and mobilizing people. The other thing is, I'm sure you've all seen or even experienced yourself or was with someone who had to share their story. And when you share a story of a traumatic experience, especially around something like sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual violence, and you're exposing pain, it's harder to connect your pain to this solution and then inviting people to take action with you without an arc that grounds you. So we're going to talk about how do we do this in a way where you can go from trauma to healing, from shame to power, and that we get out of this thing where we're just constantly stopping bad and talking in ways that are like, stop the bad in this terrible thing, to a space where we're actually creating good and naming it out loud. So that invites folks into the world that we actually need, that can sustain us, and that now makes space for us to really be able to both imagine and create a world where sexual violence and sexual assault are completely unconceivable notions to even take place, let alone like where we need to get now to a place where we need folks to even believe that or feel confident that they'll be believed, that they'll be heard, that they'll be valued. So there is a formula and an antidote, and it comes through the work that I've done with a political and prophetic and amazing project called the RaceClass Narrative. I know that some of you may be familiar with it, but what RaceClass Narrative has done is done a series of research all across the country. There's actually been some research done globally. We've done deep dives in a bunch of states, including in Minnesota. And then we've done a bunch of reiterations of this by implementing it and getting it to scale. And essentially what it says is that we need to be intentional about talking about these nuances of identity, like race and class and gender. And there is a particular framework in which we do this that actually invites people to the best versions of themselves and gets them to a point where they are motivated to change behavior. And so the moves, unlike the usual problem, solution, action, actually go a little something like this. So next slide. So it's actually, we talk about our values, the villains, and our vision. And so the first is your values. Can you click that? Thank you. Okay, so we lead with our values. This allows us to toggle on our belief in folks' minds and protect against the divisions that we know we see in the world that actually tell us that we can't do something, that we shouldn't do something, that the problems that other people face are not my direct problem. It actually invites folks into this shared idea that we have a common value. And so when we're talking about things around sexual assault and sexual violence, we can actually lean into the fact that most people believe, and this is folks across race, gender, region, income, believe that people should feel and be safe in community. We also believe that human beings are deserving of dignity and agency, and that we should be valued at the highest level possible. And so when these are core values that you can actually ground someone in, especially someone who is either talking about their own experience of pain, trauma, sexual violence, sexual assault, it is actually really empowering to connect them again to their community, to folks who are to be support systems, but also to be able to stand in their own power that this is true. Then, as you pull in all these folks, with this shared value, you get to explicitly name the villain. And that is the person, the entity who has violated that value. And so when we name the villains, we get to unveil the power interests, the corporate, political, or financially motivated actors who enrich themselves at the expense of the many and harm and scapegoat and use harm and scapegoating to avoid responsibility. And so we get to name who are the players that have actually made it hard for us to even get to the next level. So I know many of us on this call are in public health, or maybe you're here because you're in organizing, you're in coalition spaces with people who are really about creating the conditions to where sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual abuse are not things that we have to keep saying, stop, stop, don't prevent. We can get to a point where we actually have prevented it and we've created the world we need. That requires casting a vision. So it is calling folks, again, into the best version of themselves, and tapping that and naming what we're fighting for. Again, I told you, I kind of warned you that it is going to be harder in the beginning because we have gotten really used to stopping things, blocking things, getting rid of things. We're so used to being on defense. To actually go on offense with our own values and our own vision is gonna feel strange. And that's normal. And we'll get to a point where we have finally built our own memory muscle to be able to cast that vision, lean into it, and we're creating the world we need. This gets us to actually talk about the ways in which we will change the everyday lives of the people who we care about, love, and who are in our communities. All right, so I talked about race-class narrative. So I really want to go over this again in a different way, because I know if you're anything like me, I need multiple points of like, okay, how do I actually operationalize this, right? So thinking again about this idea of race-class narrative, what race-class narrative does is, again, it's a way in which we call folks like very clearly into the identities that way too often we'll try to say, oh, well, no, we shouldn't talk about race. We'll be race neutral. We'll be gender neutral. We'll be class neutral, but those aren't actually real. And the ability to be neutral on any of that is a delusion that sometimes we tell ourselves, to be quite frank. The reality is that we talk about race all the time. We do it sometimes through dog whistles, which are usually like intentional ways to create division. But sometimes because we all swim in this dominant narrative, we actually accidentally reinforce bad narratives all the time around race, right? And so when we're leaning in with our values, we get to declare the terms, create the conditions that work for us. And so opening again with that shared value allows us to toggle on the belief system. Now, you're going to see these things I'm going to repeat over and over again, and it is intentional because what happens is our brains are lovely little things that need to hear a message at least 8 to 9 times before we change our actual mentality of how we do something. And so you will hear me say something over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And oh, yes, I'll say it over again and I'll repeat it and I'll be a little redundant and sometimes I'll be repetitive because it's important for us to really get grounded in what we need to do differently, right? So when we start with our shared value, then we can name our villain. And we do that using active voice as opposed to being passive. So naming flat out who caused the problem and in what way. This is also for some of us going to feel different because sometimes we get into this habit of passively talking or just talking about systems, right? The reality is we all know racism is real. Sexism is, when I say we all know, I imagine we all know on this call, racism is real. Classism is real, right? Most people agree. Yes, those are real things. They can nod their head saying that resonates with me. But when you call them into action to do something about it, it's like, what? That's a big giant system. it's like the weather, or it happened by osmosis, or God did it, right? And it just feels far too separate from the realities of your day-to-day life. It feels far too big. You don't know what to do about it. When we get to name the villain in active voice, naming who caused the problem, who's in the way, who's the one that violated these values, it actually makes far more sense and connects to people's brains about this is the next step I should take to do something, which then we get to name action with a purpose, with and for a purpose. And this is creating the communities that we want and we need, which is then how we get to name our vision. Naming the desired outcomes and affirming what we want, which is the Brownies. And we'll go in a second about what the Brownies mean, right? But as I mentioned, the particular narrative framework that we're using is called the blank blank framework, which is the RaceClass Narrative, right? And that's really, really important. I cannot stress enough how important it is that we are explicitly naming race and class and gender when we're talking about these issues, and in a way that does not accidentally reinforce a negative narrative. And so next. Great. So when we specifically name things like race, gender, place, class, then we get to avoid this idea that like everyone automatically means everyone. Because what we've learned from our research and from experience is if we just say, this is for everybody, everyone, all people, it is very, very likely that folks that look like me, maybe folks who share the same gender as I do, will not feel like they're included in that. That is just and that is true, even if, for example, what we've learned, even if a Black woman were to say, yes, everyone will have blah, 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 there are other Black people in that space who may not believe that applies to them. I know, shocking. But that is the dominant narrative that we swim in that tells us that this majority class, i.e. usually white and cisgendered men, are the ones who will be the beneficiaries. So we need to name class and race and gender and place, and we can do that in a bunch of different ways. But when we do that and we're talking about the villain, then it exposes the racial and genderized scapegoating that happens, the fueling of divisions, and the ways in which that actually harms all of us collectively. And the reason that, and so I want to be clear about this, because when we're talking about community organizing, community engagement, real like important narrative shifts that need to happen, this requires folks to know what their own like political and personal stake is in the game. As a person who lives in a predominantly white state, I cannot tell you how frustrating it is to be with folks who would consider themselves a white ally, but actually have no skin in the game. They don't actually know what's at stake for them. And then they're just doing the, oh, I just want to help out the poor immigrants, or I just want to be there for the poor Black people. And it's like, we don't need your pity, we need your power. And so the ways in which you can do this is, again, being able to name explicitly how this actually harms all of us. And so that we can together have a clear self-interest that is grounded in ourselves and our communities and our families, and move forward in the right trajectory. So then we get to join together across all these differences to make this action possible. And then finally, of course, and coming back to this idea of like our desired outcomes, we get to, again, name race, gender, place, class, and that this is for literally all of us without exception. All right, so now I talked about brownies, right? Let's dig a little deeper into this for a second. I want you all to imagine that you are at your local grocery store, market, co-op, wherever it is that you go to buy your food, and you have a hankering for some brownies. I'm sorry if you have a chocolate allergy, but you really, really want brownies. And so you go down the aisle that has the brownie boxes to go get yourself a box of brownies. Using the chat, let me know what side of the box is facing out. The front. How do you know it's the front? I see folks saying it's the front. How do you know? It's a picture. What is it a picture of? It is a picture of the brownies. That's exactly right. That is the front of the box. Why would you think that these like advertisers, marketers, grocers would decide this is the side of the box that I want to face out? Because it looks so good. It catches the eye. Yes, yes, yes. It is showing you exactly what you came in there to buy. It even entices you both with the picture and with the words. It's like the chewy, fudgy brownies with the extra thick and fudgy goodness, the ooey gooey. Like they want to entice you, pull you in. Yes, come and get these delicious brownies. Now, you flip that box over. What do we got on the other side? Nutritional facts. Yes, yes. What else? What else? Ingredients, directions, warning labels. Yes, you got recipe, right? You got to go and get yourself some more things to buy. You got to get eggs and oil and water. You got to have a pan. You need to turn on your energy. You got to get some elbow grease going and whipping them up. You got work to do. You got things to buy, work to do, a whole list of stuff, right? When you go and you buy that box of brownies and you take it home and you open it up, do you have the ooey gooey fudgy warm goodness of brownies? What do you have in there? No, you do not. What's in there? Just mix powder. That's right. You got a bag of powder, but you were under no delusion. You didn't think you were just going to pull out warm, gooey, fudgy deliciousness, but what you bought was the promise of brownies. That is exactly how we need to be talking to folks. Way too often, we talk to people in process. We talk about the recipe all day. We got to do this. We got to do that. We got to fix this. We got to stop that. We got to do this. You got to talk to this person. You need to do this, call them, do this, give money here, blah, blah, blah. And yes, those are all necessary. But what are we actually saying about the world we're creating when we do those things? How are we talking about the ways in which families can have freedom and joy and agency and love and community? Because we have finally accomplished what we set out to do, which was ending sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual abuse. What does it look like and feel like to be able to have real freedom in your body, to have real freedom in community, to live your life with joy and agency and trust, right? Those are the brownies that we have to talk about. Those are the brownies that we need to be talking about all the time. And yes, we don't ignore the fact that we have a recipe list, but we should be leaning in first with outcomes and not just the process. All right, so the next piece that I want to talk to you about that is connected to this is the notion of active voice, right? Active voice is crucial. What we need to remember is that when we talk about the problems, and remember, we're talking about the problems as the villains explicitly, so we don't just say sexism is the problem, right? Or a system of, sexual violence, a system. No. We need to talk about the problems in a way that our brains understand. And it is that people do things. We know that. People do things. Next slide. All right. This image will probably look familiar to most of us, unless you're really, really young, but probably most of us, right? This was an event that took place during a Super Bowl halftime. I'm already seeing there are some phrases that came out of it that we know this as. I see Nipplegate, the famous nip slip. Does anybody else know there was a particular phrase that came out of this event that everyone said that this is what happened at the event? Does anyone want to guess what that was? Wardrobe malfunction. Somebody give Lori a cookie. That is exactly right. Wardrobe malfunction. A wardrobe malfunction, a nip slip, that just happened. right? That was a oops, an accident. This, no one could have controlled it. No one did it. Nothing. Like there was nothing that anyone could have done. Things just happen. Threads, they fall apart, right? But that's not actually what happened, right? What actually happened is that Justin Timberlake took his hand and removed a piece of Janet Jackson's garment from her right breast and exposed her nipple. That's what actually happened. But then it turned into a wardrobe malfunction because Justin named it as such, right? Let's talk about the aftermath of that. After, and you can, I think, click on a few things here. After Justin Timberlake named that it was a wardrobe malfunction, which is definitely passive voice. That is not actively saying, I did this thing that removed a piece of the garment and exposed Janet Jackson's breast, right? Janet, yes, thank you, Celine. Janet Jackson was shamed. And like, let's be clear, Justin Timberlake's career skyrocketed from that point. He was a huge beneficiary of the public spotlight in that moment. And Janet Jackson's career plummeted. She was immediately banned from being able to present at the Grammys. So they rescinded her offer to be able to do that. She was dropped as, so she was dropped as the presenter, and then her videos were banned from all Clear Channel radio and TV stations. Like, it drastically hurt her career. And some may say she was never able really to fully recover after that. There are also very clear dynamics in this situation where you have a white man who was able to leverage a certain level of power by naming something in a passive voice that then, because of the way dominant narrative works, that we all swim in, blame shifts to usually those who are non-white and non-male. And that's exactly what happened. Even though it was a passive voice that was like, this happened by osmosis, what tends to then happen is, oh, it's her fault. Another example of how this has happened is when we talk about, for example, housing stabilization, right? When we talk about housing stabilization, sometimes we'll say, oh, rent is so high and it costs so much and it just keeps skyrocketing. And especially for Black and Brown people, and they have to pay over 50% of their wages in order to afford rent. Now, for many of us who have a heart around housing and knowing in ways in which the housing crisis has like drastically affected folks, including Black and Brown folks, we might be like, yeah, that's awful, that's terrible. But the reality is that the majority of people hear those statistics because we all swim in dominant narrative. And two things are happening. First, they're going, what the heck? You just gave me a non sequitur. First, you were talking about rent, and now you're talking about Black and Brown people. I don't understand. Why are they connected? But also, if they are making the connections, because we just named rent is so high, it just keeps skyrocketing, then it's like, oh, well, it's the people who keep paying more than 50% of their income. That's their fault. They should have chose a better place to live. They should have got a better job. Why do they make so little anyway? They're clearly not doing what they needed to do, or they didn't get the right education, or they weren't smart enough. Blame then goes to the bodies usually that we're trying to protect, because we have named things as just a general passive osmosis, but we neglected to acknowledge that we swim in a dominant narrative that wants to shift the blame to someone. And usually that someone is the person that we most certainly want to make sure is protected. All right, next slide. So how do we do this? How do we fix this? We name explicitly that people made things can be people fix things. And so when, oh, and you know what? I hate giving people like a bad example of something without giving them a good one. So I just want to name back to the original example of rent stabilization, for example. Instead of saying, oh, rent is just skyrocketing or rent prices just keep soaring, and we would say something like, and also connected to that, instead of saying, you know, Black and Brown people have to pay over 50% of their rent, or of their income in order to afford to stay in their homes. We would say something instead like, first of all, starting with a value that most of us across race and region and income believe that everyone should have a safe, stable, and quality place to live and lay their head, right? And we know that a handful of corporate landlords, wealthy developers have used their power and their resources to pit communities against one another and to extract and exploit large amounts of people's wages and incomes, requiring them to stay in unlivable and horrific conditions. This is something that this is a choice we don't have to keep making, where we can actually say no. And then you invite, and together we can have blah, 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 and we can do these things together, and you invite people into action. But you're starting with, here is the value that most of us share. Then you're going to, you know what? There are some people, and these are the choices that they've made, and they've pitted us against one another. And they're also like extracting all these resources from Black and brown people. Not Black and brown people are paying all this stuff. They don't do that by choice, right? So we're naming who's the protagonist in the story, who's the villain. You have to give the whole plot. Okay, I'm sorry. Let me move us along. All right, so coming down to people-made things can be people fixed. That's how our brains understand things, right? So click that for me, Catherine. All right, so coming back to how I was saying, when we just talk about systems, classism, racism, sexism, xenophobia, it's a lot, it's big. It feels like we can't do anything about this. But the reality is that if we talk about it in a very clear way, then we don't have to just depend on people resonating with, yes, those things exist and I don't know what you want me to do about it. We can get people to a point of where they're actually ready to take action. And that's the beautiful thing about organizing, because we are intentional about motivating people to mobilize them to take action and to continue to take more and more actions after. And so click that for me. Oh yeah, so again, the big wideness and vastness of gaps, systems, white supremacy, it allows us to agree with it, but also leaves us feeling powerless. Where in the right-hand example, you can see that like the person, the group of people, they're doing X. When you're naming, this is the thing you can do, then it feels like, oh, that is not so esoteric that I can't take action. And that my action will actually have impact. And so the audience both gets to agree and feel motivated when properly explained using the race-class narrative that I talked about in that framework. We can actually feel motivated to take an action, know that it will have impact and power, and that it wasn't just, we don't feel powerless or in despair or apathy. All right, next slide. So, in conclusion for this section, right? I'm going to remind you again, because we're going to repeat things and be repetitive and say it over and over, that moving from pain to power requires us to talk about those 3 V's, to talk about our values first. So being able to say out loud, what matters to you most? Who do you love? Why is that important? What is grounded in you that you also know can most certainly connect to other folks across race, region, income, industry, right? And then being able to name the villain. And in what ways are your values being violated? Be explicit about the who is at fault and why are they doing it? Name the intent, right? Like, why would they do that? When you talk, and usually it's like, because they want to keep power and they want to keep resources. It's almost always the answer. And then lastly, it is naming your vision, where you're imagining a future that aligns with your values, and being able to like call it out, use your brownies, talk about it in a way that really calls into the senses. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you taste in this world that we're creating? And how do we make it together? All right. I'm gonna pass it back to you, Catherine.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Janae. Like, this has just been so great to hear you just make it real and make it plain for us and give us some real ways of thinking about public narrative and its role and all of its intersections, and just awesome. Thank you. So the next part of our conversation, we want to give you an opportunity to see this sort of in action. And the ideal would be that, you know, we could all be together, or we could talk across time and space in the Zoom platform. But what we have access to is me and Janae's voices and you all listening to us. And so we thought this would be a perfect opportunity to do what we call a fishbowl conversation. So in the next 10 minutes, we are going to do a fishbowl. I will be in the role of someone who is preparing to tell her story at a press conference. And Janae is playing the role of an organizer. And Janae's goal is to help me to frame my story in a way that empowers me and that motivates people to do something proactive. So if you will join us in this fishbowl, we would really appreciate it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can see us. And then we'll enter the fishbowl and we'll debrief it afterwards. Hi, Janae.
Hello, Catherine. I'm excited to hear your story that you're planning to tell at the press conference today.
Yeah, thank you for making time to meet with me. I wanted to go through my story with you and just get your feedback, make sure you think it's okay, and know that this is a really important initiative that we're speaking about, the Yes for Minneapolis initiative to change the public charter and create the Department of Public Safety. And I just want to make sure I get it right and can really like help people, you know, take action. So thanks for making time for me and letting me share my story with you.
Of course.
Okay.
Please.
All right, so I'll go ahead and read it. My name is Catherine, and I'm a victim of sexual assault. I was assaulted by a colleague in my graduate program at the university. It happened where we worked together in our lab, and I reported this incident to campus police, and they made me retell the story multiple times, forcing me to relive this traumatic experience. The assailant was interviewed once, and no charges were filed. They believed my assailant, and I was left with all the pain. This is wrong. I want to make sure this never happens again to anyone else. We need responders who were trained in trauma response and who believe victims. That's why we are calling for a Department of Public Safety with sexual assault responders. And that's why I'm inviting you to join us by voting yes for Minneapolis. Thank you. What do you think of that, Janae?
Well, thank you, first of all, for sharing your story. I know that's never an easy thing to do. I want to ask you first, how do you feel after telling your story?
Oh, well, it's hard, you know, it's hard to relive that and to tell that story. And I feel kind of sad. I feel kind of heavy, you know, but I want people to know about it because I want people to take action. So yeah, it's hard for me. It's hard for me to do it on my own.
Yeah. So, again, I'm deeply grateful that you have agreed to tell your story publicly. And what I want to make sure is that when you tell your story, you get to experience the power and like actually wield the power that you've built for yourself. And you're creating a lane, remembering that you are actually creating a lane, a pathway forward where many people and many women will not have to experience what you experienced, both the assault itself and the failure in the response that you received. So let me ask you this. What what is a value? What do you really believe that should that like belongs to everyone around this issue?
My value. Well, I think what's really important to me is that we feel safe, right? I mean, this happened to me at work, so I can't feel safe at work. That's not right. I think everyone should feel a sense of safety wherever they are, whether it's where they live or where they work, where they play. And, so that felt like it's taken away from me, that sense of safety. And that's really important to me. And I also feel like my voice was taken away, like I wasn't believed. And that feels really wrong too. And it's important to me that everyone is believed when they
Yeah.
experience something like this.
Yeah. And I don't think I'm going on a limb to say, I think most people would agree with you that folks should feel safe and that people should feel like their voices should be heard and valued, especially after experiencing a traumatic experience. But in general, that your voice should be heard because you're an important person, just as the nature of being a human being in this world, right? And so I would say that I think one small tweak that you may want to make to your speech is starting with that, naming that, this is what you believe, that people should feel safe. Everyone should feel safe. Everyone should be able to have their voices heard, and they should feel confident in knowing that their voices will be heard. And that that you experienced something where that did not happen. And then you get to name why, who violated that. And I heard you say this just a moment ago, that was taken from you. And so naming who the assailant and how they took that from you. Also, it sounds like that there were members of this of campus police who also did that. And most certainly not helping you to feel supported and comforted and loved in that moment. And trusting, right, that something would actually happen, that it wouldn't end there. And then naming, I think it's important. I would really be interested in hearing from you. What could have been, what would the world be like? Let me see, what's a better way to ask you this? What would have made that experience better for you? What would have made you feel supported? What is the thing that you want to create?
Yeah, I think that what we deserve when any of us experience harm is a person or community who will hold us and hear us, and honor where we're coming from and believe us. And not everyone is equipped to do that, honestly. And I think that's why I'm so inspired by the idea of sexual assault responders in the Department of Public Safety, because, they'll be trained to do that. And, it'll be a safe place for me to go and for other people to go. And I won't have to feel like I have to defend myself or re-traumatize myself in telling my story. And that's a person who I know will be there for me long term too. So, and we need that, when we go through these things, we need someone to respond, not just in the moment, but as we're processing it over time. And that's the way it should be. That's the way it should be for anyone who experiences trauma. And I think that's a possibility here with this initiative.
Thank you, Catherine. And naming like that's a possibility, you get to do that with community, because the thing you're calling them into is for community to also be accountable for creating that world with you by voting yes. Awesome. So you get to stand in your power of being able to really lead something that could not just change the world that you're in, but also for the many, many people who also need this world in order to thrive and not just survive.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Janae. I believe that. I think that like this is a chance for me to bring my community along with me in this vision, and I'm excited. I'm going to rewrite my story. I'm going to work on it a little bit more, and I'll see you at the press conference.
All right, I'll see you then.
Okay.
All right. Thanks folks for participating in our fishbowl here. But this is just an example about how we want to be intentional about how we tell our stories, right? Again, just naming, being able to talk about what are these values, who are the villains that are violating it, and what is the vision of what we can have together. Starting to connect in the minds of listeners, readers, watchers of all of the dynamic work that we're doing in the world, and finding ways to connect to on-ramp them towards a point of being able to mobilize towards that world we're creating, the world we're building. We are not selling folks tickets to the Titanic, talking about everything's terrible, everything's bad, come buy this ticket to a sinking ship. We're saying, no, we're creating a world where we can all thrive. And we want you to be a part of that with us. And then here's all the recipe things that we need to go through to get there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Janae. And I appreciate you so much for walking with me through that fishbowl experience. I want to now take the time to debrief. We have 20 minutes left in the session, and I want you to reflect back on everything that's happened so far since we first started talking about an hour and 10 minutes ago. So, what stands out to you the most? What do you think you'll remember the most? And what are you curious to learn more about? We'd love to hear from you in that way. And then this would also be the time for you to ask any questions that you've been holding on to. Janae and I would love to interact with you directly, and we have a little bit more time on the clock to do that. So yeah, tell us what you think. So the brownie analogy, very helpful way to approach change, to approach a vision, starting with positives. Awesome.
Brownies, yes, I love the brownies.
The brownies is great.
The brownies is great. I want to acknowledge a question someone sent me in a private chat, but just want to say it because I think it's useful for everyone. So they asked specifically, why wasn't gender named in the naming of the race class narrative? And I'll start by saying, so RaceClass Narrative started in 2016. So, nothing going on in this country at that time. And there were, the reason we even decided to really dig into this research was because as an organizing coalition, we're out talking to people on the doors about, creating this world that we can all have. So we're talking to folks about like universal healthcare and universal childcare and like all of the goodies and brownies, right? And so we were talking brownies and vision all day, but we missed the villain. And so what we would get when we were especially out in places like rural Minnesota, that folks would say, yeah, universal health care sounds good. Universal child care sounds good, but is my Somali neighbor gonna get it? Because Sharia law is coming. And that was a clear indication for us that there's something missing, that it was that we had by necessity to have like really grounding conversations about the dog whistles that they were hearing, the ways in which especially race had been used to pit people against one another, to block us from being able to even have conversations about our values and our vision. And so because it was just incredibly clear that race was being used, and like it would come on in different ways. Again, in like Minnesota, where we do have a large population of Somali refugees. So it was like a anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-Black thing that really just boiled down to like being about race. It was like an immediate triage need to be able to talk about race and class together. Now, in the next iteration of the research, which was about a year later, we also became really clear in the ways in which racial or genderized scapegoats also, and like, to be clear, this research project was vast. So we did everything from poll testing, language testing, message testing, dial testing, group test, like there was a lot. And so all of the things that came out of that in these multiple iterations also confirmed that yes, we should absolutely be talking about gender, which I'm sure many of you already knew that, but it's good to have the proof points, right? And we had already named like race class narrative. So going like race class gender. And quite frankly, in general, it's really about being clear about identities. Because as I mentioned, you know, the anti-Muslim sentiment is real in Minnesota, for example. And so it'd be like race, class, gender, faith, you know, gets a little expansive in terms of titling. But we are, again, the most important piece, I think, is just to be able to name explicitly the fact that these scapegoats or these dog whistles are used to divide us so that we don't trust one another, so that we won't work together across these differences, when really the folks that tell us to be fearful, to be afraid, to not trust are the ones that are benefiting from that. They're benefiting from us not working together. And so, yeah, I just wanted to name that piece.
Thanks, Janae. And there's a lot of great things happening in the chat. One of the things that seems to be bubbling up a lot is this question around villain and how specific can we get? How specific should we get with naming villains? And it reminds me a little bit of my first organizing campaign when I first moved to Kansas City about 10 years ago, and we were working on a campaign to cap the rate on payday loans and predatory forms of lending in Missouri, which boasts a stunning 1,900% cap on interest in the state, and that's, you know, obviously legislated and allowed by law. And we had an opportunity when we were in the midst of a ballot initiative for that campaign to name a very specific person. And we made a conscious choice, even though we knew it would be a risky, and it was risky. It proved to be a risky choice for us, but we felt that it was the right choice because what we were trying to demonstrate was how much power organized money has in the state of Missouri. And by naming this billionaire in St. Louis that was underwriting campaigns for these legislators who were maintaining this predatory loan rate, we were able to get our message across, which was we need serious ethics reform in the state if we're ever going to be able to carry out the voice of the people through ballot initiatives, because right now money is talking louder and it's winning. And so it helped us to be able to name that. And then, you know, that journey, we didn't win that campaign, but we have moved towards ethics reform in our state. And I believe that by having front and center the narrative around that specific, our values, what we care about as a coalition, and the villain and our vision for what our state and how decisions are being made in our state, I believe that made it possible for us to get to this point politically that we're at, where we're actually having meaningful discussions and great organizing around ethics reform. Janae, you might have something else to add.
I think that's a brilliant example. I think also thinking about sometimes, you know, especially in the realm of like sexual assault, sexual violence, I want you to kind of think about some of the villains that we don't name explicitly, but could really be a system, right? So we talk about like the system of silence. We'll say, oh, it's because of the systems of silence, or the acceptance of silence that, you know, and instead saying, because, you know, a handful of people have really benefited from folks not being heard, that they get to do XYZ. Really, the thing about the villain that's important, because we're all in different places in the work, and like, especially someone who does a lot of more of like the political policy work, it can get tricky when you're talking about, because I think someone even named like, you know, a single entity, or people who make policy, or people who are funding people who make policy. Like there's a bunch of different ways you can slice it. And so this really allows us to be strategic on how we want to talk about it. One thing that I will name that's really important, especially for those of us who are working in like public health and like thinking about like larger policies that we want to push and change, is that we don't want to villainize, which I mean, I don't think we need to say this, but I think it should be said, that we don't want to villainize government, for example, but instead being able to say like a handful of politicians. And if you have the leverage, name the politicians, right? Who have benefited from, you know, from people being silenced, from not, you know, being able to have their voices heard, from, you know, folks keeping jobs who are not qualified to be the people we should be reporting to when harm happens, from not keeping folks safe. They're responsible for us not having the ability to keep one another safe because of XYZ. Like actually naming the person, the group of people, the entity, again, never just saying the senators or, you know, the legislators or whoever, but like saying a handful of politicians, a group of politicians, this particular group, this particular person has done XYZ, like being explicit. And I know sometimes like folks will say, oh, well, you're the one being divisive. But when you're naming it, that is couched in, here's our value, the one that we all share, that actually isn't based on like your partisanship or your gender or any like particular identity. It's actually based in the reality that we share this, and this person has violated it. And this is like also naming the intention, why they did it. And most certainly you can do so. Okay, let me continue this thought, and then I'll also name like the villain, the assailant as the assailant as the villain, the offender. So then when we get to do that, then that's it. You're coming back to that vision that allows folks to, again, you're sandwiching in there that we can do this together. These are solvable things, and these are choices that people make. All right. So again, connecting it to this is a choice that folks take, that folks make, and it's a decision point, and that we get to make a different decision, and we can do that together. Now, when we're talking about the villain as like an individual offender, like, yes, that's also a reality. And we did talk about, and I know a lot of us work in this notion that we don't want to just seclude it to individuals making poor choices, which we know happens, but connecting it, the importance is to connect it to this larger thing, because what we're doing is we're not just wanting to change the like lived reality of this one individual, we're actually wanting to change the lived reality for all of us. And so even in, for example, the fishbowl that you saw with Catherine and I, Catherine getting to name that like the person who assaulted her is most certainly a villain. She also got to name the ways in which the police acted as a villain with their failure to respond properly and to create the supports. And then the community was leveraged along with her as a protagonist that gets to make a choice that holds those folks accountable and gets to usher in like qualified professionals who are readily trained and available to do the kind of work that we shouldn't be having police do. So there's, again, it's like actually naming these steps as opposed to just saying, the systems of racism, classism, sexism, blah, blah, blah. Like those things are real. I don't think anyone here would deny that. And we need to talk about how do they actually play out. It's more like the nasty tasting brownies of these systems. We have to actually talk about those things. How do they manifest in the world? Not just naming them as a system because that's just too big and hard.
Great. We might have time to address one more question. So I don't know if Ashley, if there's a question that you've seen that we haven't gotten to, maybe call that out for us.
Yeah. Well, gosh, I mean, I've been keeping abreast of what's going on in the chat the whole time, and there's just been so much gratitude for the frameworks and the metaphors and examples that you have been giving throughout this session, Catherine and Janae. So just wanted to, I'm sure you're seeing all of those. Robin had a question about how do we get these strategies out there? Like what works best? in person? Do these things work virtually? Can this strategy be used in like a social media campaign? Do y'all have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd say all of the above. I think it depends a lot on your context. The way that I share this idea and the strategy around public narrative is typically in a very like small container where I'm working with a small community or coaching an organizer or someone in the community who's doing work to mobilize around a certain issue. So my way of engaging in these frameworks and teaching others is very direct, but I know that there's power in doing that in a more public way. And Janae can probably speak to that. This is her wheelhouse.
Yeah, so yes, you're right. Robin is right to assume, yes, you can do this in all those things, in speeches, in person, in virtual engagements, but also in print, email, social media, ad campaigns. So as I named before, I do this work with communities of faith who have made the choice to like take this bold public step into public life. And so they're speaking truth to power at press conferences and also testifying at hearings and all of that. But also we've gotten like the RaceClass Narrative framework to scale in the state of Minnesota. We've done it through like branding campaigns. So we ran an entire campaign in 2018 called Greater Than Fear. And so the entire notion was that Minnesotans are greater than fear, and we will not allow a handful of people to tell us that we should be afraid of one another when we know that on the other side of that fear is all the things we need to thrive. So no, I'm not going to be afraid of my Somali neighbor. As a matter of fact, we're going to work together to ensure that those who haven't been paying their fair share finally do so, so that we can have the community that we all deserve, right? And so there's a bunch of different ways to do that. Most certainly, we've created like digital toolkits that we share out with like coalition partners, and then they can like take those usually have like, and most of us, I think many of us have seen like digital toolkits, but like sample tweets and things like that. Also guides on how to write letters to the editor and op-eds, so that we're actually telling these stories in that framework in public spaces. With the Yes for Minneapolis campaign, which is a very real campaign that is fighting to replace the current police-only model. So would be replacing our current Minneapolis Police Department with a much more expansive Department of Public Safety that has a public health focus. So police would also work hand in hand with folks like sexual assault responders, mental health crisis responders, interveners around helping those who are experiencing homelessness, like actually, fully resourcing our public safety. And on that note, I also want to add, like, this is a really good an analogy of what we're seeing in the world right now. So the ways in which I was talking about how we usually get used to saying don't stop, can't end, right? Like the same thing happens around policing right now. Right after the murder of George Floyd, we saw over and over and over this notion of like yelling defund the police. But the reality is that actually isn't grounded in our values, in the sense that, defund is an austerity. It's like cut. And we actually want to fund things. We want to fund our lives. We want to fund our lives. So it's grounded though in this notion that we want to feel safe, and we know that we're not feeling safe. So being able to say, actually, we want to fully resource our public safety. And that means having both like the finances, but also the right people to give us the right size responses when we need them. And what we're finding is that isn't always police. And quite frankly, most of the time it's not. And so being able to talk about that in a way, again, that leans into the values, leans into what we really want, allows us to really shape that narrative. And again, you can do that in probably every medium that you could think of. You can have that play out.
Awesome. Well, I think that is it for us. Our email addresses are on screen there, so jot that down if you want to keep talking. It has been so great to be with all of you today, and I hope that you take what you need from this and make it work and go out and imagine and create the world that we want. We have that power. So blessings and respect to all of you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Janae. Thank you, Catherine. I want to just thank all of you who attended this workshop. Thank you to our ASL interpreters, our Spanish interpreters, our closed captioners, and my Valor colleagues, as well as NSVRC. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference. And thank you again, Janae and Catherine. This was so fabulous. So much gratitude to you both. Take care, everyone. This will conclude this session of NFAC 2021.